and answer session of today's conference. At that time, if you would like to ask a question, you may do so by pressing star, then 1, and recording your first and last name. I would now like to turn the call over to your host for today, Mr. Patrick Shepard. Sir, you may begin.
Excellent. Thanks, Christine. Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest installment in our confidential financial disclosure massive open online course. I'm Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl King-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Patrick.
So this exercise is designed to build upon the massive open online course that we've put together before.
Yes.
So if folks haven't done so, would it be a good idea if you're new to maybe start at the beginning with the first session of that class?
Yeah, I think that the intentionality for this session today was basically to add another exercise onto the already several exercises I think that we've done in the past. I think we have 3 or 4 exercises that are attendant to this MOOC. So if you haven't had the opportunity to review the first iteration of the MOOC, where we go into explanations about what the purpose of the confidential financial disclosure system is, and we literally walk you through the form, and we talk about what you should see where and what is required to be to be reported. That would probably be helpful to have under your belt before walking through this exercise.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean that you can't participate in this exercise. It just means this exercise may not be quite as beneficial because we won't be going through some of the basic nuts and bolts of the 450 filing.
Right. I'd also like to point folks to the financial disclosure playlist on the YouTube channel.
Yes.
So we're going to be discussing a number of authorities today as we work through the exercise, and we're not going to have an opportunity to go into those in great detail. So if you'd like to learn more about, say, the conflict of interest statute, you can find several sessions detailing that statute, financial disclosure playlist. And we're also planning to add another broadcast to that in the coming weeks, dealing with the exceptions that we find at 5 CFR 2640, some of the more common ones that we see during disclosure reviews. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, do look for that registration announcement in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, yes. So shall we get started?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, if we can have the slides, that would be awesome. As you said, Patrick, or as we said before, we have other exercises that are available to folks. With each exercise, we try to craft an exercise that addresses a wholly different set of duties, so that we can get at different types of particular matters that can present a conflict of interest, and we can investigate how financial interests arise out of the person's participation in certain types of particular matters. So we like to start, and we're on, for those of you who are just on the phone, I'm going to try and remember to let you know when I'm advancing through the slides. We're on slide 2 right now. We like to remind folks that the confidential financial disclosure system really has a singular purpose, and its only purpose is to identify and hopefully prevent conflicts or potential conflicts of interest and other ethics concerns. So unlike the public financial disclosure system, which has a disclosure for the sake of disclosure component to it, we aren't as concerned with the niceties, if you will, of like technical compliance in terms of making sure that the forms are absolutely sterlingly filled out. We're concerned with making sure that our first priority is to review what's on those forms for any potential conflict of interest.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note, and I think you'll also find that reflected in OGE's regulations on the confidential system. OGE is empowered to decide what needs to be reported on the 450, and we have done so with this in mind. Our goal is to prevent conflicts and to provide you just the information you need to avoid conflicts of interest. So where you see differences between public and confidential disclosure, that's because we are able to reduce the amount of reporting burden, and we do so to the point where, the question is, do you have enough information to prevent conflicts? And if you do, good.
Right. Moving on to the next slide. This is a sort of a visual representation of 18 U.S.C. Section 208, which is the primary conflict of interest statute, and it's a criminal statute. And this is sort of the mother of all of the sort of ethics conflict of interest laws that we are responsible for implementing and for providing advice and counsel on. And kind of in a nutshell, effectively what we're looking for is there any nexus between the government matters that an employee is assigned to work on and that would be tasked with working on, and any sort of financial holdings or other types of interests that the employee might have that could be affected by the outcome of those government matters. And wherever there's an overlay between those two things, where the outcome of the government matter could in fact have some effect on the interest that the employee holds on the holdings or other interests that they have, then we're looking at potentially a criminal conflict of interest. We're going to argue, or we're going to talk a little bit more about things in addition to 18 U.S.C. Section 208 that you need to be mindful of. But this is in effect what you're looking at when you receive a financial disclosure form. They're giving you that one piece of information, which is here are my holdings, here are the interests that I have and that my spouse has and dependent children. Now I need now I need you to tell me whether or not any of these are going to present any problem. So obviously, if you want to do a conflicts analysis, that other piece of information is something that you're going to have to get. And the employee is not necessarily going to be the one that's going to provide that to you.
So we're going to have to find out what our filers are actually doing.
Yes.
The information on the form is not sufficient to do a conflicts of interest analysis. We need either from the supervisor, the employee, him or herself, or other sources to find out what it is these people do for the government.
Right, exactly. And on the next slide, this is again just a reminder to you all that when you review, and particularly when you certify, if you're the certifying official on a 450, an OGE Form 450, your signature basically affirms the following: that you conclude that the filer is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So you cannot, or you should not, I guess, sign your name to have as the reviewer or certifier of the form if you have not conducted an analysis that would allow you to draw this conclusion.
Right. So regardless of what the filer provides initially on the form, we're going to have to get enough information to say one way or the other that there's a potential conflict we need to mediate or mitigate, or there's no conflict. And
Right.
Until we can answer that question affirmatively, we shouldn't certify the report.
That's exactly right. So on the next slide, so what are the primary ethics authorities that we're concerned about? We just highlighted 18 U.S.C. Section 208, the criminal conflict of interest statute. We're also concerned about impartiality in the performance of an employee's duties. And while that falls squarely within Subpart E of the Standards of Conduct, I think it's a more general appearance of conflict concern that you bring to the table when we're talking about impartiality. So we don't necessarily think you have to hone in exclusively on the detailed covered relationships that are explicated in Subpart E. And we're going to talk about that when we go through the form today. There are going to be opportunities for you to sort of flag things that in your own mind you think, wow, okay, well, if these are the relationships that my employee has with these non-federal entities, maybe we need to think about what this person's going to be doing and the extent to which we want them participating in matters that in which these folks might be appearing before the agency or appearing before this employee.
And I think this is one of those areas where it's important to remember that the 450 system is really a risk mitigation system.
Yes.
And there are various kinds of risks we can manage through review of the confidential financial disclosure reports. Certainly criminal liability to the employee is a big one.
Yes.
But it's not the only one.
Right.
So where information disclosed on these forms might lead someone to criticize the government or someone to question the impartiality or integrity of government processes and procedures, we should use that information to help manage those risks, regardless of whether or not there's a specific provision of law or regulation that might be violated.
Yeah, and I think that this is even more true when we start getting into notions of misuse of your government position. I think the Subpart G provisions, the misuse of provisions, are some of the broadest and some of the most foundational in ethics. And again, this is kind of a reminder. Not only is this not only is the review of the 450 whatever sort of a risk assessment, it's also a request for advice and counsel. So when you're seeing things on the form, irrespective of whether or not they are particularly disqualifying or would require any kind of a recusal or other kind of remedy, it is your opportunity to counsel the employee based on things that you see on the form. So for example, I mean, if you see that someone is engaging in an outside activity, and let's say that your agency doesn't have a prior approval for outside activity, that's your opportunity to use that as sort of an inroad to the employee to, remind them about misuse of position considerations, use of title, use of time, use of authority. So again, we're just trying to sort of like remind you that when you're doing this substantive review, yes, 208 matters. Yes, the impartiality provisions matter, but there are certainly broader considerations that you should be bringing to the table and be using those as sort of your way of educating your employee about what their ethical obligations are above and beyond, maybe just financial conflict of interest types of issues. And then finally, subpart B, the gifts provisions, because there is a section on the form that also provides for the disclosure of gifts and travel reimbursements. So if we go on to the next slide, again, these are just sort of general reminders. Your due diligence with respect to your review, as we've been saying for the past few minutes, is really in the substantive area of review. That doesn't necessarily mean that technical aspects of review don't matter, but your technical review really should be in support of your substantive review. And by that we mean it's not as important whether or not something is reported in a technically perfect way. What's important is has the filer given you sufficient information for you to be able to identify what the thing is,
right,
so that then you can thereafter conduct your substantive review and see whether or not it seems to implicate any law or reg.
No, exactly. And I think one of the questions I like to keep in mind when I'm looking at an individual entry is, do I have enough information in this entry to say either it's definitely not going to pose a conflict of interest, or it potentially poses a conflict of interest and we need to take action?
Yes.
And if the answer is I can't tell the difference between those, or I don't have enough information to make that determination, then I don't have enough information. I need to get more,
right,
regardless of what the regulation says.
Right. And we're going to see this in a moment when we walk through our exercise, but there are going to be instances where you're going to need more information, and it may very well be information that is not required to be disclosed on the form, but you truly cannot do a conflicts analysis without that information. So the reporting requirements are not the be-all and end-all of what the information that you may need in order to do a conflicts or other ethics scrub on your reports. They're
really the starting point.
They're the starting point.
The opening bid.
Yes. And and then the other bullet point here we have is document, document, document. We really encourage you to maintain really accurate reviewers' notes. Record any questions and additional information that you get from your filers. Reduce to writing any of your substantive determinations, and certainly if you do have sort of prescriptions for your employee based on things you found on the form, we very much encourage you to issue cautionary memos or even ask the employee to sign an ethics agreement where they commit to engaging in certain activities or not engaging in certain activities because of certain holdings or interests that they might have. The more that you document that, the better off your program is. And also, and for even like succession planning purposes, if somebody has to come in behind you, in subsequent years, you want to have a nice record of discussions you've already had, conversations you've already had with the employee. So it isn't even just like an enforcement thing. It's also just a continuity of operations sort of importance.
And yeah, I think of this along the lines of your suggestion earlier, that what we're talking about is really a request for advice, right? The report itself is a request for advice, and that the outcome of that should be some kind of advice document. So where there's potential for conflict or a step someone needs to take, we should make sure that that advice is provided in an appropriate format. Something else you might consider doing for those employees who report, who complete reports, but they don't have potential conflicts, is letting them know that their report's been certified and that they don't have to worry about conflicts of interest.
Yes.
I think a lot of our employees feel like this is an annual paperwork exercise. They maybe don't have complex financial holdings. They don't hold things or positions that might conflict with their duties. So they feel like I just have to give you this information for no reason every year. But by letting them know that you've taken a look at it and they're free of conflict, that can help them to see the value in it. And I've seen some agencies implement this model practice in a number of ways. But one way is when you're finished reporting reviewing all the reports, you can send your filer list a note and say, we've certified all the reports. If you've heard from us, you know what you're supposed to do. If you haven't, it's because you don't have a problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're small enough here at OGE that, I think we have like 14 filers maybe. But that's precisely what I do, is once I've reviewed and certified the report, I just send them a quick email, basically just saying, I want to let you know that I've reviewed your report and certified it. Okay, on the next slide, Among the materials that we gave you an agency profile and a profile of the employee whose 450 we're going to be looking at here in just a moment. So I want to take one quick minute to sort of review what our agency is and who our employee is, because it's a fictional agency, obviously, but it's based on some extant actual federal government agencies. But we need to know this. This is information that's absolutely critical, because this is like the one half of our conflicts analysis, is knowing what our agency does, and more importantly, what our employee does. So we are the Occupational Safety Office. That's our agency, and the specific division that we're going to be looking at, the employee that we're looking at, is within the Laboratory Safety Division. So the Laboratory Safety Division, it promulgates rules, publishes guidance, obviously to make laboratories safe for the personnel who work there. They work with standards. I get a set of standards for laboratory safety, and the areas that are covered by those standards include exposure to hazardous chemicals, bloodborne pathogens, hazard communication, personal protective equipment, and eye, face, and hand protection. So that gives us a sensibility about the universe of sort of like areas that where particular matters are going to be arising from. But if we then look on the next slide and in your materials at our actual employee profile, our employee is the director of this division. So clearly, this is someone with supervisory responsibilities, so it's going to be sort of the full panoply of things that occur within the lab safety division is going to be under this person's cognizance. And so to give you a flavor of what this person is responsible for, clearly they're overseeing the work of all of the laboratory personnel, which is going to include safety inspectors and technicians. These safety inspectors and technicians collect data based on their inspections, and that data then goes into recommendations for regulatory and policy changes. So we're looking at clearly a body of matters that can be fairly broad-based.
Right.
Reviews and contributes to proposed rulemakings on laboratory safety and training requirements. And then finally, this person also serves on a laboratory safety advisory committee for the office. So that's an additional duty. And the Safety Advisory Committee is providing scientific and technical advice and guidance. The advice and guidance pertains to general issues relating to improvement in laboratory quality and laboratory medicine practice. And they provide advice and guidance on specific questions related to possible revision of safety standards. So I want to stop for a minute. We're going to talk a little bit about like what we have to be thinking about in the context of duties and stakeholders. But the one point I want to flesh out here a little bit, Patrick, is often when if you have someone who has sort of like a full-time position, but then they're tagged with sitting on an advisory committee, there might be a whole nother sort of like part of the office that's sort of separate from where they typically work, where this advisory committee resides, or sometimes it's even in another agency.
Right. So this might be a challenge for us.
Right.
To really keep on top of the potential matters that could come before our filer.
Mm-hmm.
We may be very familiar with the work that she does at the home office as a supervisor, but this advisory committee work may be more opaque to us, and we may need to get help from someone from the outside to manage potential conflicts there.
And in some agencies, I know that it's at the committee level, where either the committee manager or the designated federal officer has an ethics responsibility with respect to sort of overseeing the functionality of the advisory committee. So for some of you, then that may mean coordinating with those folks with respect to your employee, and it might very well be that they also get a copy of the 450. And for many advisory committees, they actually want to do some sort of before every advisory committee meeting, having some sort of attestation that there are no conflicts of interest, or reviewing the forms before each of the committee meetings, and then having the committee members confirm that there isn't anything new that's not on the 450 that they might want to that could create a potential conflict for them. So it's just a heads up to you all about that there might be some sort of administrative coordination that you may want to do if you have folks like this who serve both as in a full-time position, and part of their duties is to serve on an advisory committee. Okay, so when we look at the director's duties, I just want to highlight a few things here, because I think what we have to think about before we even look at the form, before we even start looking at the form, is to focus in, okay, so what are the duties that our person is likely going to have? Because we're concerned about any particular matters that the person's going to be working on for purposes of 208. So we really need to be thinking about what those might look like in light of what we've had described to us. And Patrick, it looks like that we have both kinds of particular matters that this director is likely going to be participating in.
Yeah, I find that with employees like this who have broad duties, it's easy to be under-inclusive in the kinds of matters that we think about. So this first category we have here, the specific party matters, these are the ones that tend to jump out. Right, because we have named parties, we know who's involved, we know who's affected. So our investigations, inspections, grants, contracts, credits, etc. We sort of understand that, right? Those stakeholders are easy to identify. A nexus between a financial holding and a stakeholder kind of jumps off the page. The matters of general applicability are also covered under the law.
Yes.
They're just much harder to see.
Yes.
Much harder to see.
Yes, they're much harder to see. And also, I think that we lose sight of them because they are, by definition, broader. They are matters that have a broader application, and they might affect a large class of entities. So when you're talking about standards and policies for laboratories, you're talking about matters that do affect an identifiable class. And so any of the standard making, any of the rule making, regulations and policies that is going to affect, safety protocols in laboratories or certification requirements or whatever, even if it's affecting all the laboratories,
all the laboratories are
an identifiable class.
Discrete and identifiable class.
Yes.
Yeah, and we have here with our description of what our office is responsible for, that basically we're responsible for a discrete and identifiable class of workplaces. Right. So most of our policies and regulations are probably going to qualify as particular matters of general applicability, or subsets of those probably will.
Exactly. So we focused on sort of what the duties are, and to get ourselves a sensibility about, okay, so they're probably going to be specific party matters. We're clearly going to have inspections that this person's going to have to be involved in, and the grants and things like that. But it's a standard setting organization. They're involved in the rulemakings and in contributing to rulemakings. So then we have to think about, okay, so who are the stakeholders? I mean, who are the people, who are the entities that are, or class of entities that are likely going to be affected either by the broad standards, the broad policies, the broad regulations, or more discreetly by sort of specific party matters that may be becoming or may come up under the guise of lab safety. And I don't know if you want to comment at all on some of these stakeholders. This is just a list that I came up with, that seemed...
I just think it's a general matter. If you're new to an agency or you're new to reviewing forms for a particular office, getting a sense like this is a really good idea. You can do it in an informal way through discussions. Some agencies use a more formal process of actually, making a list. But so that before you begin your review, you kind of have a sense of the outer corners of the types of entities that you might be concerned with, and that at least gives you a place to work in from.
And if you look at this list, I literally sort of came up with this list yesterday based on information that I was reading myself and trying to do some of my own sort of educating myself on this. I mean, I started with the most obvious, federal research and clinical laboratories. Obviously, it's laboratory safety. So clearly, they have a stake in the work of this division. Hospitals and universities.
They have some labs there.
They have some labs there, yes. Healthcare-related companies. Whether or not they have labs, they would be producing things that labs need. Laboratory equipment and supply manufacturers. That's another one that's fairly obvious. Lab safety education and training programs. That one might not be quite so obvious. But clearly, if you're going to have protocols and if you're going to have standards, people have to be trained on what those standards are.
And those trainers will be affected by the policies that we implement or
Exactly.
require.
And so, and anytime protocols change or regulations change, that can add, to somebody's portfolio of training opportunities that they can have. So there are a lot of private education and training programs out there, either through universities or just from outside of academia. And then finally, I listed professional associations and societies because they also have a stake in weighing in sometimes on these regulations and protocols, or they too can be educational and training program sponsors.
Right.
So again, I encourage you to do that. Is to be thinking about what is the universe of stakeholders here, so that when you're looking at the form and you're trying to figure out, is this somebody that might be affected by the work of this organization, you've kind of pre-prompted yourself before you get into the actual form itself. Okay, so now let's jump into the confidential financial disclosure form. On the front cover, I mean, this is just you get a quick and dirty look at this. You see she's the director of laboratory safety, and we see that she does have assets and income on part 1. The only thing she doesn't have are reportable liabilities, but we should definitely be seeing some assets or some things listed on all the other parts. And she has signed the form, so that's good. So those are the sort of the first things you want to sort of do as a quick and dirty to make sure that you've got it complete. If the form is not signed, I mean, there's almost no point in like reviewing it. You really need to get the person to sign it because they have to attest to the fact that what they put on the form is
It's
correct.
Also good to make sure that you date stamp these when you receive them.
Yes.
When OGE does a program review, that's something that we're going to be looking for. And if we don't see it, just doing that, make sure that you avoid an easy recommendation.
Yeah, and if we go back to the other slide, to the prior slide, it's right up in the top corner on the top left hand corner is where you would put in the date that you received the form. Okay, so let's jump into part 1, assets and income, and we're going to walk through each of these listings individually and respectively, and talk a little bit about. Primarily, we want to talk about, okay, what questions does this raise? What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? But more importantly, kind of like what, if anything, are we going to have to ask the filer about this? So let's start with the first one, Patrick. And the first one is Patel Consulting.
Yep. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of those cases where this may be technically sufficient,
Mm-hmm.
except it doesn't tell it anything.
Right.
Right. In order to determine whether this is going to pose an issue for us, we're going to have to know lots of things about this. Who does this belong to?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Is this the filer's holding?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the filer's spouse's holding? Is it a family business? Do they have a position there? What is this thing?
Right.
And then also, what do they do?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't know. Just merely saying that it's a consultancy doesn't give us really any clue as to the nature of their business and whether or not there might be a nexus between that business and the work of our agency. So yeah, I think those would be my first questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it is interesting to be thinking about that. That it might very well be sufficiently disclosed, but that doesn't help us. So this is one of those instances where you can't tell what you're looking at, and unless or until you know what you're looking at, you can't do the analysis.
Right.
So let's say for example that this is it doesn't indicate it's the spouse's, but let's argue for argument's sake that it's only the spouse's consulting business.
Right.
What are some of the things that we might be concerned about if this is the spouse's consulting business?
Well, I think we'd be concerned that the consultancy has any business before our agency.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the obvious one that jumps out.
Mm-hmm.
Something we might not think about are the identities of the clients,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because those clients might have work before the agency, and that could pose either a real conflict of interest or an appearance consideration. Might ask if the filer has any sort of relationship or role in the business.
Right.
So, if I was at an agency that had prior approval requirements, that's maybe a place in this person's file that I might look to
Mm-hmm.
see, is there an attendant prior approval requirement or form that we've looked at? Have we seen this before?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, I think those are the kinds of questions we want to ask.
Yeah, and I think that we do need to know fundamentally. I mean, is this a source of earned income? Is this an investment?
Right.
does the spouse have, like you said, do they actually have a role in managing it? I mean, are they the consultancy? They are it. How is it structured? Do they, contract directly with clients? Do they do it through the context of the business? To get a sensibility about like the sort of like the the way that it's structured and
Right.
how this person, if they have financial interests, what type of financial interests do they have? So question though, Patrick, let's say that it's both the spouse and our employee. Does that necessarily make a difference for purposes of our conflicts analysis?
Not necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but it may. Certainly if the employee serves as an officer or employee of this organization, all of the organization's financial interests are going to be imputed to the employee.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to consider the entirety there.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just the spouse, we may not be as concerned, right? We're certainly the spouse's interests are imputed to the employee, but maybe not all of the interests of the consultancy would be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think anytime you have the employee participating in a role in one of these in an outside business, you want to make sure that they get that whole the entirety of the counseling we provide when we look at outside activities,
Mm-hmm.
because there are not just conflicts of interest concerns here, there are lots of other considerations.
Yeah, for example, let's say that this is a consulting business that engages in lobbying.
Right.
That might be a concern for us, particularly if it's the employee who's engaging in that kind of service, because we have another criminal statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 205, which prohibits government employees from basically making those kinds of representations back to the government on behalf of a third party.
Sure.
So we would be dealing potentially in another criminal conflict of interest statute. So we really have to sort of like, unpeel this onion and get a lot more information about the nature of the services, the nature of the financial interest, who the clients are, if they are our clients. And I mean, maybe it's an inactive consulting business. Maybe
Right.
it's still extant, but it's inactive. So we need to know, is it active? Is it dormant?
And it could be completely unrelated to the filer
Yes.
or the work of our agency.
Exactly.
But, they could be, I don't know, they could be a gardening consulting business that's run exclusively by the spouse.
Right.
And then we have no issue. Or it could be a consulting business that deals with lab safety,
Mm-hmm.
In which case we might be into a 3 or 4 page opinion on the first line of the form.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really why we need to get the information.
Yes. Okay. So if we go into the next thing on the form, which is Johns Hopkins Hospital, and it looks like this is the spouses. So here we've listed some of the questions that we think that we would want to ask about this one. Again, where it's what is the spouse's position with the hospital, and what does the spouse do, and why do we care about that?
I think we have a couple of considerations. Is this the spouse's position likely to put him or her in contact with our agency?
Mm-hmm.
We want to know what they do because they may work in an area that is regulated or overseen by our agency, so we could have potential for an actual nexus there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think again that's always what we're looking for. We're looking for, is there any nexus between what the spouse is doing in their outside employment, or any financial interests that they have that are associated with that outside employment, and the work that the employee would be engaging in. So we'd want to know things like, what financial interest is there? Does the spouse have anything other than salary that they derive from their employment with the university?
But,
go ahead.
Because as we know from the criminal conflict of interest law, that the spouse's financial interests are treated as the employee's own. Right. So could our work here at OSO affect the level of the spouse's compensation? Could it have an effect on any equity interest they might have? Is there a possibility for them to gain or lose as a result of our work? And if there is, that's a serious concern for us, and we may need to take some remedial actions to make sure our filer doesn't participate in those matters.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting because I think sometimes folks, when they see employment interests like hospitals or other sort of nonprofit types of organizations, there can be the misapprehension that because it's not a for-profit entity, So you're not dealing with stocks and that type of a financial interest, that the financial interest is somehow mitigated or is non-existent. And that's just not true. It takes a little more spelunking, though, I think, to determine whether or not there's anything that the employee can do in her work as director that would have a direct and predictable effect on the spouse's employer. Because that's really what we're looking at. Johns Hopkins is the spouse's employer. But I think we also want to make sure that if the spouse is doing any discretionary things within that, which maybe the spouse is doing some lab research, where there are other ways in which the spouse can be directly affected and not simply through the general auspices of their employment with Johns Hopkins.
Right. Yeah, here's one of those cases where we have to parse the line very carefully between a potential criminal conflict of interest, which would occur if the spouse's financial situation could be affected by our work, and an appearance concern if it were merely the employer. But in any case, we need to look at this carefully and make some good determinations about recusal requirements or other remedies.
Okay, the next thing that we have listed is AdvaMed, and it's an indication of honoraria. Do you know what AdvaMed is, Patrick?
I haven't the foggiest.
Well, I didn't know either. And as it turns out, we've given you this in a handout. It's a little bit brief description of, we've actually given you an info, I'm not sure what you call these, an info graphic, I guess it is. But there's also, I also looked on their website, and to give you a little bit better sensibility, this is Advanced Medical Technology Association. It's a trade association, and they are engaged in advancing medical technology. They have nearly 300 members, and they are member companies, and they generally are engaged in medical devices, in the production of medical devices. So it's a medical device trade association, effectively, is what it is.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts about this?
This feels nexus-y.
Does it feel nexus-y?
A little bit, you know. I could see that there's maybe an overlapping between the work of this trade organization, or certainly some of the constituent organizations that might belong to it, and potentially our work overseeing the safety in laboratories. So, you know, I think there's sort of at least initial reason for concern.
And I think that because it's honoraria, I mean, what does honoraria say to you? I mean, what is your best guess at what you think maybe this spouse is doing for them?
You know, often, you know, this is a payment that's received as a result of, you know, speaking or teaching or writing. It's typically sort of a one-off situation. So, you know, there's nothing here that suggests to me that there's an ongoing employment relationship, but that at some point services were probably provided and this source of income was received.
So yeah, I mean, I think that would be something that I would want to probe a little bit, which is, you know, was this a one-off? Is there an ongoing agreement or arrangement with AdvaMed, with your spouse and with the filer's spouse and AdvaMed, just so that we have a sensibility about whether or not there's still an existing financial connection between this organization and the spouse, because that could be a material consideration. But clearly, even if there isn't, I think you still have to be concerned about some impartiality considerations. So that, let's say, for example, that AdvaMed, it's clear that they do lobbying as well. It's pretty clear from the way they describe themselves that they're very much engaged in trying to affect public policy and regulation. So there's every reason to believe that, to the extent that they're representing device manufacturers, that there could be a possibility that they would be interested in the work of our filer.
And I think this is an example of a place where, you know, subpart E might not be explicit, that we need to be concerned about a covered relationship, but that there's obvious concern for the agency. You know, say, for the sake of argument, this honoraria was received for delivering a keynote at an AdvaMed conference, a sponsored industry conference. The filer spouse provided the keynote address and received a payment. A few weeks later, AdvaMed is advocating before our agency and, in fact, before our employee. There's plenty of room there for criticism. There's plenty of room there for stakeholders to feel that maybe doesn't support the integrity of our operations. At least such that we want to think about it. You know, we want to make a determination: is this a real appearance consideration? Do we need to do an authorization? And having, your suggestion that we document is really good, because if we determine that, the filer really needs to participate in that matter, notwithstanding the fact that their spouse recently delivered the keynote, to have thought about that before the criticism arrives puts us in a much better place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So again, this is a situation where we really need to know, we need more information than we have, and understanding what the relationship is between the spouse and this organization is absolutely critical in order for us to do an adequate analysis of where our filer's potential vulnerabilities lie. The next item on the part 1 is an IRA, and we see this all the time where, and thankfully our filer has obviously been better than some filers are, because many filers will just put IRA down there, and
then we get to go ask.
And then we get to go ask. We get to go back and ask. And our filer has at the very least listed 2 things in their IRA, and there may be other things, right? Because I mean, because if they have diversified mutual funds, those aren't reportable. Right. So just because there are 2 things listed does not necessarily mean that there aren't other things in the IRA. It's just they may be other things that aren't right. reportable. So Vanguard Healthcare, what do you think, Patrick?
Yes, I'm not sure what this is. I hope it's a mutual fund, because we may have some regulatory relief here. So, I'd want to make sure I could find this fund. So I'd go to Google or the preferred finance search engine, or even Vanguard's website, and see if I can locate this very thing.
Okay. Well, they say it's an ETF. So
if it's an exchange traded fund, basically for our purpose, if a fund is a fund, treated like mutual funds. So that's good.
Okay.
So we want to make sure we can find it.
Okay. So if it's treated like a mutual fund, then that also means that it's eligible for the exemptions. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. But you don't think that they were just listing that it's a healthcare fund is sufficient to determine whether or not it's a sector or diversified?
We're going to need to look at the stated purpose.
Okay.
The healthcare funds, like say the technology funds, sometimes don't specialize in individual sector. Right? The healthcare sector is something like 20% of our economy, and it includes it. And this fund may include hospitals, medical device manufacturers, drug companies, home care, insurance, and on and on and on. And I think if we were to include all of those industries, we might have a diversified fund on our hands. So this may be overreported, and it may be eligible for the relief for the diversified mutual fund exemption. But it also might not.
It also might not be. Yeah. Okay. So then what about the other one, which is the iShares U.S. medical devices?
So I know from having visited the iShares page a number of times that these are usually exchange traded funds. That's their business. So that's good. That means this is probably going to be a mutual fund for our purposes, so therefore eligible for those exemptions for mutual funds. Medical devices, not so broad as the healthcare sector, quite a bit narrower. So I think this is going to fall squarely within our sector mutual fund category.
Okay, so we feel fairly comfortable that this one's probably a sector mutual fund.
Yes.
And it's eligible for the sector mutual fund exemptions in 2640. Now, isn't the sector mutual fund exemption, unlike the diversified mutual fund exemption, is not a blanket, you can own any amount, correct?
That's right. So we're going to have to find out how much this thing's worth.
Yeah. And the reason that it's really material that we get, that we hone in on whether the other one is also
right
sector mutual fund, because I think arguably, even if it's not exclusively dedicated to medical devices, these are both in a sector that we think is problematic.
That's right.
So my assumption would be if the other one
yes
is a sector mutual fund, we have to aggregate the 2.
Right.
So we're going to need to know the value of both.
That's right.
And if it exceeds $50,000, is that correct?
I think that's right.
Let's look it up.
Let's take a look.
I'm going to take a real quick look. I should have looked it up before. But that's a really important thing for everybody to remember, is that you don't get any values on these forms.
Right.
And there's been plenty complaints about that. So trust me, we understand that that's a point of contention with a lot of folks. But so you are going to have to go back and find out from the employee exactly what their funds are worth,
what the value is. And you know, in OGE's defense, these funds could be held by this person in sectors that are completely unrelated to our work.
right?
In which case, not requiring them to report the values and not requiring us to ask about them because there's no nexus makes a lot of sense. But in the case where we have the overlap, you know, we're going to need to dig in. And I think our reasoning is that even if you had the value, you'd have to have a contact with the employee about this anyway, either to advise them not to buy anymore, or to monitor, or to divest below the threshold.
Yes, and I've just looked at 2640.201 is where these exemptions reside. So it's 2640.201B, sector mutual fund, and it's paragraph 2, 1 little I, and the aggregate market value of interests that are exempted, it cannot exceed $50,000. So we would have to, if they both are sector mutual funds, we would have to ascertain whether or not the aggregate market value of the two did not exceed $50,000. Okay. So if we move on to the next thing that's on the part 1, we have the American Chemical Society, and that's all we have. Now, this is one of those instances, though, and actually we probably should have made reference to this too when we looked at Patel Consulting, is when you see something on part 1 that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of explanatory value, sometimes it's useful to look at other parts of the form to see if there's information there that can help inform what the thing is. So in this instance, if we look at part 3, you'll see that they have included, the filer has included the American Chemical Society on part 3. And they indicate that they are an instructor for the American Chemical Society. So what are you thinking about this one, Patrick?
So this seems like an outside employment type relationship. So we can maybe intuit from here. I think this is another place where I'd look to the filer's file to see if we've looked at this outside activity, provided any advice on it. We may get some clarity about whether this is an employment type relationship. Instructor's a little bit ambiguous there. You know, it's possible that they're a paid employee of the American Chemical Society as under the title instructor. It's also possible that they might be something more like an active member, where they participate in the society, and one of the things that they do as part of their membership is provide instruction to other members. So I think, you know, here we'd want to find out, because it's going to be very important to us whether or not they're an employee, officer, director, trustee, general partner, etc. of this organization, because if they are, all of that organization's financial interests must be treated as if they are the filers.
Yes. So we have to determine, you know, what the nature of their relationship is with this organization. And then once we know that, then we can start digging down into whether or not the employee has any duties that can affect the American Chemical Society. Was there anything else that we would necessarily have? The American Chemical Society, was the filer required to indicate on there that there was earned income, that it was salary, that it was a fee, that it was an honorarium? That
it will be helpful to know. They're probably not technically required to tell us exactly what this source of whatever it is, but it's going to be important for us, because say this was a one-off presentation and this is, you know, properly described as an honoraria, they received the payment one time. Well, there might not be an ongoing 208 relationship here. However, if this is a salary that they receive bi-weekly for a class they teach all the time, that looks a lot like an employment relationship, and then we have to consider the entirety of the American Chemical Society's financial interests, and we have to consider those going forward.
Right. And we're going to come back to this in a second when we revisit it on part 3. Okay, the next one on the next page is BioRaft. Any idea what BioRaft is?
No clue.
Okay. BioRaft, I had a piece of paper here that said what it was. Hang on one second. Here we go.
There we go.
Yeah, because I even gave this to folks in the audience. I just have too many pieces of paper here, folks, that I'm trying to rifle through. It says BioRef provides an integrated portal and reliable software framework for research, safety, and compliance management. It decreases total cost of operations and reduces organizational risk. So it's some sort of a software, you know,
compliance
monitoring, improves laboratory safety. It's a system. So it's some sort of a, I guess, you know, we're looking at sort of medical technology. Everything's going with the electronic health records,
right.
And so I'm assuming that from this description that this is along those lines where it's helping people to employ their EHS systems, and it's a software, information technology type of vehicle that they.
I think at this point you'd find me moving quickly in the direction of our outside employment counseling.
Yes.
Because this also seems to be an area where there might be a nexus between the duties of this person and the office, and this outside activity.
Right. So I mean, and that's the key, is that when we go and we look at part 3, we see it's also on part 3, where they're listed as a consultant. And that, that's kind of a tricky, and we're going to come to that in a second, but I want to go back to, for purposes of part 1, I think it's enough that we've established that they clearly have some sort of employment relationship with this organization, and
right.
we need to kind of drill down into it. And thankfully they provided us with that information on part 3, because otherwise we would be completely in the dark as to what that particular asset represented.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to part 3 in the interest of time, because we're coming up to the hour here. Going back to the American Chemical Society and the instructor position. Anytime, I think particularly if you don't have prior approval, but even if you do have prior approval, I think you want to make sure that the person actually, if you require prior approval, you want to make sure that anything that's on part 3 that people did get the approval for it before engaging in it.
Right.
But if you don't have prior approval, I think that finding stuff on part 3 is the opportunity for you to engage in some proactive advice offering.
Yep.
Because outside activities are just rife with potential problems, ethics problems that run the gamut of all of the ethics authorities. And I think that it's really behooves you to, whether the employee has sought advice, to provide them with advice once you do see an outside activity. So some of the things that I would want to know is, what are these services as an instructor? And as Patrick said before, what actually does that create? What type of relationship does that create between the employee and this organization? We obviously are going to want to know, what is the content of the instruction? What is the nature of the things that you're engaging in? And
right.
Why do we want to know that? Why do we care about that, Patrick?
Well, because we're concerned here about a nexus between our work and the instruction that they're providing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This gives us a clue as to whether or not there might be matters pending before the agency that could affect this organization or the employee's specific work.
Mm-hmm.
We could also have misuse concerns.
Mm-hmm.
We could have considerations about using non-public information. Or using sort of government materials, things that should properly be part of this person's official responsibilities, getting paid by an outside source. We may even have a supplementation of salary consideration.
Right. And and this is something that clearly, if it is instruction, if it is truly just their teaching, we're going to want to scrub that under the 807 provisions
right.
in the outside activities, subpart H, to make sure that any of the relatedness tests that apply in that section, that they're fully and squarely in compliance with 807, if they're being compensated for this instruction service. And I think we also just, I agree with you that we want to make sure that, like, how did you land this job, and are you effectively providing for them for compensation something that your organization would typically provide either for free or
right.
Yeah,
and I think if folks are new to doing outside activities counseling, we do have a massive open online course. It's about a 4-hour class.
Mm-hmm.
And we did really encourage you to look at it, because these are really complicated. Completeness is really the watchword when you're talking about counseling employees on outside activities.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a challenge. It's one of the hardest things we do as ethics officials, is counsel in these situations. So if you're not familiar with this process, we would recommend that you become familiar.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I want to highlight too, with respect to this particular activity, is I know that anyone who's familiar with 807 knows that there is a carve out for teaching certain courses, so that the restrictions aren't quite as expansive for certain kinds of teaching. But what I want to remind folks, the danger in that is that in that provision of 807, that carve out is really for teaching that occurs at institutions of higher education or other qualified sort of institutions. So, primary, secondary institutions of higher education. So this organization may or may not qualify as an organization for whom that teaching exception carve out would apply to our employees. So, I don't want us to get too sanguine in being concerned about when we see teaching, because we think there's a lesser standard when you're dealing with, with teaching. Moving on to the BioRaft consultant position. Again, we want to know, did the employee get prior approval if needed, and did they seek or receive any ethics guidance on this? Consultancies can be really kind of problematic, and it really depends on what the services are that the employee is providing as a consultant. If they're effectively, helping this organization have an unfair advantage in understanding or being able to apply some of the regulatory standard setting kind of work that our employee does, we're looking at misuse of position. We're looking at use of public office for private gain. In addition, potentially to, so with these types of things, we're looking both at how one could be misusing their government position to benefit someone with whom they have these relationships, but then conversely, how someone could be using their government position to sort of benefit themselves, or to be giving an unfair advantage to an outside organization, even if it's not affecting the work they're doing for the government.
Right, and I think in these cases, it's important to remember all of the provisions under Subpart G. With special emphasis on non-public information, but also title and the appearance of sanction.
Yes.
So if this person is appearing to convey the authority of our office to some of this work, that's certainly problematic for us.
And one thing I just wanted to highlight for folks, I know we're running out of time here, but one thing I wanted to highlight for folks too is there's an example in our outside activities regulations at 2635.802 under conflicting outside employment and activities, and it's example 2, and it kind of addresses a position that's very similar to the one that we're looking at here with our employee. The example is an employee of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration who was and is expected again to be instrumental in formulating new OSHA safety standards applicable to manufacturers that use chemical solvents, has been offered a consulting contract to provide advice to an affected company in restructuring its manufacturing operations to comply with the OSHA standards. In this instance, the example says the employee should not enter into the consulting arrangement, even though he's not currently working on OSHA standards. And it says, because even though the consulting arrangement wouldn't be a conflicting activity within the meaning of 802, it would create an appearance that the employee had used his official position to obtain the compensated outside business opportunity. And it would create the further appearance of using his public office for the private gain of the manufacturer. So when you have a really close nexus between what the person does for the agency and then going out and basically taking that understanding and knowledge and sort of selling that service in a way that differentially affects or benefits an affected entity.
Right.
Our argument is, even if there isn't a 208 problem per se, or a 502 problem that's created by that, you shouldn't do it to begin with, because it looks like you're using your public office for private gain. Okay. On part 4, our filer has listed to you CREF, which is basically, it looks like a retirement plan that they had with a former employer. And I think the only thing I would do there is just to make sure that there wasn't any holding that needed to be reported on part 1 that we should take a look at.
And this is a place where I'd look at last year's notes. We may have already dealt with this problem. And if we haven't, if this is the first time we're seeing it, make a note for next year.
Right.
Save yourself some time.
And then the final thing that we have under the part 4 for gifts and travel reimbursements is the employee evidently was engaged in attending a conference sponsored by the Association of Public Health Labs, and they were given the travel costs that were associated with participation in that conference. This is one of those where I would want to, see whether or not Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I moved
skipped
ahead
one.
of myself. I did get ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Part 4, American Chemical Society. Sorry. An agreement to teach laboratory safety course on April 2017. So that kind of seems to answer a little bit the question we had before.
Well, yeah, and I think, this is very good to know because we know there's an agreement for future work. So if we were wondering if American Chemical Society's interest should be imputed to the employee, they should be.
Right.
Because we have an arrangement. Actually kind of clarifies things for us. And the question we'd have is there a nexus between their responsibilities and American Chemical Society, because they couldn't participate in matters affecting them. And we'd also want to see, have they received all of that outside activity guidance about this this proposed thing, so we can make sure that they don't fall into any difficulty with subpart H or the other standards of conduct.
That's right. Very good. And my apologies for blowing right through that. Okay, so now we're in the Association of Public Health Laboratories, where our employee has listed this travel reimbursement. I think the thing that jumps out at me about this to me, Patrick, is this sounds like something that they might have been able to actually engage in their official capacity. And so I'm wondering, is this really something they received in their personal capacity, or was this like an over-reporting of a payment that,
Which happens a lot. And this is another good reason to keep good advice logs. If you've done 1353 authorization, say, for example, for this, that's a gift to the government. So it needn't be reported here. We don't have to worry about it. If they attended in their personal capacity, you want to look and see if we authorized that, through either the gift provisions or another law.
Yeah, and I think that if they did receive this in their personal capacity, then that raises a whole host of other issues about, like, why were they going there, and what authority did they use? If this is a prohibited source, what authority did they use to accept the travel payments? Did they actually participate in the conference, or did they merely attend? Sort of like, you really need to drill down into the facts of why they were given the payment, whether or not they could accept that travel payment.
Right.
And
or if somehow this might be a prohibited gift.
If this might be a prohibited gift. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that's all we have with respect to the form.
I guess we have just a minute. Should we open the phone up for any questions right now?
We can certainly do that. Christine, can we open the phone lines and see if anyone has any questions?
Yes, thank you. At this time, we'd like to begin the question and answer session of the conference. If you would like to ask a question, please press star, then 1. You will be prompted to record your first and last name, and to withdraw your question, you may press star, then 2. Once again, if you would like to ask a question at this time, please press star, then 1, and record your first and last name. One moment for the first question, please. The first question comes from Christine Dixon. You may ask your question.
Hey, Christine.
Thank you so much for the training today.
You're welcome.
I had a question about a list, an entry that I saw recently that I had never seen before, and I've been doing this for several years now. It's for a 401A alpha. I researched the 401As and compared in comparison to 401Ks, but it was a very different type of holding, and it seemed like it was more employer controlled than a 401k, where the employee is deciding where their assets are being invested. And so I was wondering if you had any guidance on a specific asset like that.
I think, when it comes to these tax advantaged holdings, the question we're really looking at is, what is it? What are the things that could possibly be held in it? Are things being held in it, and should those be reported? So if those were sector mutual funds or individual securities, they should be reported, and our analysis goes to those underlying holdings. If it's some sort of deferred compensation or payment arrangement with the former employer, we're really looking at, what's the nature of that payment? Is it possible that the employee could take action that would affect the magnitude, the size of the payment, or the ability or willingness of the employer to make the payment in the future? So those are really the questions, is, what is it, and how does it provide us the possibility for gain or loss? And is it possible for the employee's duties to affect a change in either the payment or to the interest of the holdings?
And so when the employee comes back to me and says that they have no idea what the holdings are, is that sufficient then for me to make that determination that they can't that there is no conflict? And this is it regards a spouse's retirement benefit from a public school system in an entirely different state.
I see.
And they've called the human resources, they've Googled the 401A alpha,
Right.
And they just can't give me any more information. So that leads me to, I mean, I had no reason to question their credibility on
Sure.
that.
Yeah, and I think, there's just sort of a due diligence threshold. I think the question I would have is, does this entitle them to a specific kind of payment in the future? Because it very well may be that the manager of the fund or the program, they do something with the funds, and that's of no concern to us as long as the relationship between the filer's spouse and the plan is a contractual one where they're basically obligated to make some payments in the future. So that's the question I'd focus on first is, is this an entitlement to future payments? And if it is, I think you can treat it like a defined benefit pension plan where we just look at the ability or willingness.
Yeah, because I mean the critical distinction typically between these types of plans is whether and to what extent the employee themselves has any discretion or ability to direct and select from the investments of whatever vehicle they're using to fund the pension. And if the person who's receiving the benefit has absolutely no ability to direct or control the holdings, then we aren't concerned about the holdings. We're looking more over at the payment that the person is being promised as a result of whatever investment.
Of using the 2640 exemptions. The 2640 exemption for retirement plans may be applicable here. And you just have to look at those requirements. And I think we'll cover those in our next session.
Yeah.
To see if that relief is available. And if it is, then you can answer the question affirmatively that, this isn't going to pose a conflict of interest because it's exempt under the 2640 exemption for pensions and similar arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'll look at those exemptions as well. And worst case scenario, I'll click the interim review and training session.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome.
A reminder that is *1 for any questions. I'm showing no questions in the queue at this time.
I think we've fully occupied the hour and maybe a few minutes beyond. But we do appreciate everyone joining us today, and I appreciate you being here, Cheryl. And we look forward to joining you soon with that presentation on the 2640 exemptions. And again, if there are topics that you really feel we should be doing training on that we haven't, do let us know, because we do try and be as responsive as possible to your training needs. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.